They treated me like an invisible member of the family, forcing me to hide in the darkest corner of the banquet hall, dressed in faded old clothes. Everyone assumed that the powerful, ruthless Duke of the North had come for my proud sister, adorned with expensive jewels. But when the doors opened, this tyrant, who made every noble tremble, walked straight through the fawning crowd. He didn't even spare a glance for my sister, but stopped before me, trembling. In the deathly silence of the entire hall, he knelt on one knee and gently brushed the stray hairs from my cheek. Why does the most precious jewel in the entire hall hide in the darkness? 3 weeks later, when my stepmother and sister saw me again, they were forced to kneel on the cold marble floor, gazing up at me, high on my throne, in despair. The grand estate was suffocating beneath its veneer of wealth. Tonight was the most important social event of the season. Every unmarried woman was desperate to secure a powerful match. I was only brought along to hold my sister's spare shawl. I stood in the drafty corner near the servants' entrance. The cold chill seeped slowly through my thin slippers. I watched the swirling dancers with a hollow ache in my chest. I had long accepted my terrible fate in this cruel household. I was born of the same blood but treated worse than a scullery maid. I kept my gaze lowered to avoid drawing my mother's harsh scolding. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the grand ballroom. Heavy shadows clung stubbornly to my isolated corner. My mother smoothed my sister's expensive silk gown with loving hands. She deliberately turned her back to me. Beatrice was the prized jewel of our prominent family. I was the forgotten afterthought. My dress was tailored from faded, borrowed velvet. The orchestra struck up a sweeping waltz. Elegant couples drifted onto the polished marble dance floor. No one asked me to dance. I shrank against the cold stone pillar. I only hoped to blend into the ancient tapestry behind me. Being completely invisible was my daily survival strategy. My father only acknowledged me when he needed a servant's task completed. Tonight, I was merely a dull background prop to make Beatrice shine brighter. Guests murmured endless compliments to my glowing sister. They completely looked through me as if I were thin air. I stared down at my worn leather shoes. I truly wished the floor would open up and swallow me whole. A sudden, heavy hush fell over the entire ballroom. The cheerful music faded into a tense and hesitant silence. The heavy oak doors groaned open. Duke Nathaniel stepped into the grand hall. He carried an aura of absolute power and quiet danger. Everyone in the room instantly bowed in deep deference. A sea of vibrant silks and rich velvets parted for him. He was the undisputed master of the Northern Territories. Rumors painted him as a ruthless commander who spared no enemies. He possessed immense wealth that rivaled the crown itself. He was a man who bowed to absolutely no one. His presence commanded instant obedience from every soul present. The wealthy lords suddenly looked like frightened children. The confident ladies nervously adjusted their low-cut bodices. He was a solitary force of nature entering a room of fragile glass. He wore no excessive jewels or flashy medals. His raw authority was his only necessary adornment. My father practically tripped over his own feet rushing forward to grovel. He bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the polished floor. Beatrice adopted her most alluring and confident smile. She tilted her chin up to catch the candlelight perfectly. She purposefully positioned herself directly in his path. The Duke did not even spare them a passing glance. His piercing gaze swept over the desperate nobility. He looked utterly bored by their pathetic displays of subservience. His dark coat absorbed the light around him. His broad shoulders seemed to carry the weight of empires. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried to press myself deeper into the welcoming shadows. I did not want the attention of such a dangerous man. Then, his dark eyes locked onto my corner. The air in my lungs vanished completely. His gaze was intense and completely unwavering. He began to walk with deliberate purpose. He stepped smoothly past my fawning father. He completely bypassed a shocked and humiliated Beatrice. Every heavy footstep echoed loudly in the silent hall. The crowd watched in stunned, breathless disbelief. He walked with the predatory grace of a confident hunter. He was heading exactly toward my hidden pillar. I felt the sudden weight of 100 staring eyes on my skin. Vicious whispers rippled through the crowd like venomous snakes. They wondered who this pathetic girl in the shadows could be. They questioned why the great Duke would even look in my direction. My father's face turned a pale shade of sickly grey. Beatrice's perfect smile crumbled into an ugly sneer of raw jealousy. I wanted to run away and hide in the comforting darkness of the gardens. My feet remained firmly glued to the marble floor. Murmurs of utter confusion erupted among the noble ladies. My mother gasped audibly in sheer horror. I froze entirely in my place. My trembling hands gripped the faded fabric of my skirt. I kept my chin tucked down in a submissive posture. I hoped he would simply walk past me toward the balcony. He did not walk past me. He stopped right in front of me. He towered over my small, trembling frame. The heat radiating from his large body chased away the draft. Up close, his features were strikingly handsome and incredibly severe. The faint scent of fresh pine and worn leather surrounded him. The entire room held its collective breath. Even the orchestra members froze with their bows hovering over their strings. I slowly raised my head to look at him. I stared up into his striking eyes in utter bewilderment. His expression was unreadable but intensely focused. He slowly reached out a large, gloved hand toward my face. My family watched in silent, terrified agony. He gently brushed a stray, messy curl away from my cheek. His touch was surprisingly tender for a hardened warrior. "Why is the true jewel of this room hiding in the dark?" he asked. His deep voice resonated through the deafening silence of the hall. He did not pull his hand away. His thumb lightly traced the delicate line of my jaw. A sudden shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He finally offered me his arm. The gesture was a silent command masquerading as a polite request. I hesitated for a brief, terrifying second. I slowly placed my small hand upon his solid forearm. The collective gasp from the nobles echoed loudly against the vaulted ceiling. My miserable life as an invisible ghost ended in that exact moment. His fingers gripped my hand with a firm and protective warmth. The music flared back to life with a sudden and frantic energy. The musicians were desperate to please the terrifying Lord of the North. He guided me effortlessly onto the center of the marble floor. The crowd rushed backward to create a massive and respectful circle around us. I felt incredibly small beneath his intense dark gaze. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs with every step we took. I had never danced in front of an audience in my entire life. My stepmother had forbidden the tutors from teaching me proper steps. Yet his movements were so commanding that my body followed naturally. It felt as though he was carrying me above the cold ground. His massive frame shielded me completely from the hostile stares of the court. I could see my family standing near the edge of the floor. My stepmother looked as though she might faint from sheer fury. Beatrice was trembling as her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Her face was twisted into a mask of deep and bitter hatred. She could not understand why her invisible sister was receiving such an honor. Suddenly Beatrice broke away from my father's restraining grasp. She marched directly toward the edge of the dancing circle. "Your Grace, please wait," her shrill voice cut through the music. The orchestra faltered slightly but kept playing at a much lower volume. The Duke did not stop moving as his eyes never left my face. "You must be mistaken," Beatrice cried out in a desperate plea for attention. "That girl is nothing more than a stain on our family name. She does not belong in your presence or in your arms." A collective gasp rippled through the gathered nobility at her sheer boldness. My father reached out to grab her arm with his face white with terror. The Duke stopped his movement with a slow and deliberate grace. He turned his head slightly to look at my trembling sister. The temperature in the massive room seemed to drop instantly. His eyes were colder than the winter frost of his vast northern lands. "Who allowed this creature to speak to me?" His voice was a low growl. The silence that followed was heavy and absolutely terrifying. My father threw himself to his knees on the hard marble floor. "Forgive her, Your Grace, she is foolish and young," he begged. "She only speaks the truth about the quiet girl you currently hold." The Duke took a step toward them while pulling me tightly against his side. The possessive movement was completely unmistakable to everyone watching. "Your family possesses a rare jewel of unmatched purity," the Duke said coldly. "Yet you treat her like filth while elevating this loud and empty shell." Beatrice looked as though she had been struck physically across the face. "If anyone insults my chosen lady again, I will ruin your house by morning." The threat was delivered without anger, which made it infinitely more terrifying. My father nodded frantically as his entire body shook with primal fear. He dragged Beatrice backward into the suffocating crowd and completely out of sight. The Duke turned his full attention back to me. His severe gaze softened the very second he looked at my face. "Do not look at them, Audrey," he murmured softly. It was the first time I had ever heard him speak my name. My breath caught in my throat at the sound of his deep voice. "How do you know who I am?" I whispered as I looked up into his dark eyes. A faint and enigmatic smile touched the corner of his lips. "I know everything about you, my sweet girl," he replied quietly. "I have watched you from afar for a very long time. I watched you endure their endless cruelty without ever losing your kind soul." He spun me gracefully as the orchestra music reached a grand crescendo. My faded velvet dress seemed to catch the light like diamonds in that specific moment. I was no longer the invisible ghost of the noble manor. I was the strict focus of the most powerful man in the entire realm. The realization sent a sudden wave of warmth rushing through my frozen veins. For the first time in my entire miserable life, I actually felt valued. For the first time I felt completely safe from any earthly harm. As the final notes of the sweeping song drifted away, he did not let me go. He kept his large hand firmly placed on the small of my back. "Come with me," he commanded softly as he led me toward the grand exit. No one dared to step in our path as we walked out together. The noble crowd simply parted like a sea of terrified sheep. We entered the long and drafty stone corridor leading to the main entrance. The cool night air rushed in fiercely through the open front doors. I began to shiver uncontrollably in my thin and worn dress. Without uttering a single word, the Duke unclasped his heavy black coat. He draped the thick and incredibly warm fabric over my trembling shoulders. The coat smelled intensely of him. It smelled of fresh cedar wood and the crisp winter wind. Suddenly my stepmother appeared directly from the dark shadows of the hallway. She looked totally desperate as her hands twitched with nervous energy. "Your Grace, please reconsider this terribly rash choice," she whispered frantically. "Audrey is weak and has no proper dowry to offer a man of your high status. My Beatrice is accomplished and wealthy and completely ready to serve you." The Duke did not even pause his powerful stride as we walked directly past her. "Your eldest daughter is a venomous snake," he stated without looking back. "And you are the exact person who raised her to be so hopelessly vile. Consider yourselves incredibly lucky that I do not strip away your titles tonight." My stepmother gasped loudly and collapsed against the cold stone wall in utter defeat. We finally reached the grand stone steps just outside the massive estate. A magnificent black carriage drawn by 4 massive horses waited patiently for us. The uniformed footman bowed low and instantly opened the heavy carriage door. "Where are you taking me?" I asked as a sudden pulse of fear rose in my chest. He turned to me with his dark eyes shining brightly under the pale moonlight. "I am taking you far away from your living nightmare," he said gently. "You will never have to step foot inside that wretched house ever again. From this exact moment on, your true home is in my northern castle." He held out his strong, gloved hand to help me climb into the luxurious carriage. I stopped to look back at the grand manor one last time. The tall windows were glowing brightly, but the inside felt entirely dark to my soul. I placed my small hand back into his. I stepped into the carriage and left my miserable past behind forever. The carriage interior was a sanctuary of dark velvet and polished mahogany. The rhythmic sway of the wheels lulled my exhausted body into a strange state of peace. I clutched the Duke's heavy coat tightly around my fragile and shivering frame. The rich scent of cedar and crisp winter winds surrounded me completely. Nathaniel sat opposite me with his broad shoulders relaxing slightly in the dim light. He watched me with an intensity that made my pulse flutter wildly against my throat. I had never been the subject of such undivided and careful attention in my life. The bitter cold of my painful childhood began to melt under his steady gaze. "You are entirely safe now," he murmured softly into the quiet space between us. His voice was a deep rumble that vibrated pleasantly through the solid floorboards. I nodded slowly while trying to suppress a sudden wave of fresh and overwhelming tears. These tears were not born of sorrow but of profound and unfamiliar relief. He reached across the small distance and gently captured my trembling fingers. His thumb stroked my knuckles with an unexpected and delicate reverence. It felt as though he was holding something incredibly precious and extremely rare. My blood family had always treated me like a broken and utterly useless burden. This fearsome northern warlord treated me like a revered and cherished queen. I dared to lift my gaze and meet his piercing dark eyes fully for the first time. There was no pity in his expression, only a fierce and unwavering possessiveness. "They will never be able to touch you or harm you ever again," he promised quietly. "Anyone who dares to make you feel invisible will answer directly to my blade." A strange flicker of genuine courage ignited deep within my weary and bruised soul. I rested my head back against the plush velvet cushion and allowed myself to breathe. The landscape outside the frosted window gradually shifted from manicured southern lawns to untamed wilderness. Dense forests of towering pine trees replaced the elegant rose gardens of my past. Snow-capped mountain peaks eventually pierced the dark and starry canvas of the night sky. We were officially entering the harsh but wildly beautiful heart of his legendary northern domain. The journey felt endlessly long yet completely comforting within the safety of his presence. A massive stone fortress finally emerged from the swirling and ghostly highland mist. The ancient castle was a breathtaking monument of raw power and undeniable strength. Flickering torches lined the towering defensive walls like a glowing crown of bright fire. Heavy iron gates groaned open to welcome their returning master without a moment of hesitation. The carriage rolled smoothly into a sprawling and immaculately swept cobblestone courtyard. Dozens of uniformed servants stood in perfectly straight lines to await our arrival. They held glowing lanterns that pushed back the creeping and frigid midnight shadows. I shrank back slightly against the corner of my seat in a sudden panic. I was terrified they would look at me with the same cruel disdain my family possessed. Nathaniel squeezed my hand firmly to ground my rapidly spiraling and anxious thoughts. He stepped out first and offered me his arm with flawless and confident chivalry. I stepped down onto the smooth stones with my anxious heart lodged firmly in my throat. Every single servant immediately bowed in deep and profound respect at my presence. There were no mocking whispers or cruel sneers anywhere in the crisp night air. An older woman with kind eyes and a pristine white apron stepped forward from the line. "Welcome home, Your Grace," she spoke directly to Nathaniel with a highly respectful tone. Then she turned her warm and welcoming gaze entirely upon my nervous face. "And welcome to your true home, my lady," she added with genuine and soft warmth. I froze completely at the sound of that highly respectful and completely foreign title. No one had ever addressed me with such immense dignity or basic human decency. Hot tears finally spilled over my eyelashes and traced silent paths down my pale cheeks. Nathaniel quickly raised a gloved hand to wipe the salty moisture away from my skin. "Show her to the master chambers immediately," he instructed the kindly head housekeeper. "Prepare a warm bath and bring the finest silk garments we possess for her ultimate comfort." The housekeeper nodded eagerly and gestured gracefully for me to follow her lead. I hesitated for a brief moment and looked back up at my towering savior. He offered me a small and incredibly reassuring smile that softened his severe features. "Rest well tonight, my sweet Audrey," he commanded gently while reluctantly releasing my hand. "Tomorrow, we begin your new life as the undisputed and beloved mistress of the North." I walked into the grand and brightly lit hallway feeling a strange sense of belonging. The magnificent tapestries on the massive walls depicted ancient legends of bravery and enduring love. The crackling fires in the huge stone hearths chased away the lingering winter chill entirely. Other servants bowed their heads politely as I passed them in the sweeping corridors. They did not stare at my faded and worn velvet dress with any judgment or mockery. They only saw the woman their terrifying duke had personally chosen to bring home. The master chamber was a sprawling oasis of rich burgundy fabrics and carved dark wood. A massive silver bathtub was already steaming invitingly in the center of the adjacent bathing room. The kind housekeeper gently helped me remove the heavy and masculine outer coat. She handled my cheap and ruined dress as if it were spun from actual solid gold. I stepped into the fragrant and incredibly warm water with a heavy sigh of pure exhaustion. The floral-scented oils seemed to wash away years of accumulated humiliation and deep sorrow. I leaned my tired head against the cool silver rim and closed my eyes peacefully. The invisible and unwanted girl I used to be was officially dead and permanently buried. A revered and powerful duchess was finally taking her very first confident breath. I knew my family was probably reeling in absolute shock and horror back at their estate. They had thrown away their most precious jewel without ever realizing its true worth. Now, the most dangerous man in the kingdom was going to ensure I sparkled brilliantly. I sank deeper into the soothing water and allowed a tiny, triumphant smile to form. The morning sun filtered softly through the towering arched windows of the master bedroom. I woke up slowly inside a bed that felt softer than a gentle summer cloud. For the first time in my memory, there was no harsh shouting from my stepmother to wake me. There were no demanding chores waiting for my aching hands in the cold kitchen. Instead, a quiet and respectful knock sounded on the heavy oak door. The kindly head housekeeper entered followed by 3 young maids. They carried large wooden racks filled with the most spectacular dresses I had ever seen. The fabrics were woven from the finest silks and rich velvets in the entire kingdom. There were gowns of deep sapphire, vibrant emerald, and elegant midnight blue. Every single garment was brand new and meticulously crafted. Not a single piece was a faded hand-me-down from my cruel sister Beatrice. The maids helped me dress with an immense amount of care and gentleness. The emerald silk gown fitted my slender frame perfectly as if tailored by pure magic. I looked at my reflection in the tall silver mirror and barely recognized the girl staring back. The exhausted and pale ghost of the southern manor had completely vanished. In her place stood a beautiful young woman with a quiet glow of budding confidence. I walked down the grand stone staircase with a lighter step than I ever thought possible. The sunlit dining hall was filled with the rich aroma of fresh bread and roasted meats. Nathaniel was already waiting for me at the head of a massive wooden table. He stood up immediately the exact moment I stepped into the room. His dark eyes swept over me and softened completely at the sight of my transformation. He personally walked over to pull out a heavy carved chair for me to sit down. "You look absolutely breathtaking, Audrey," he murmured in his deep, resonant voice. My cheeks flushed with a warm tint of pink at his genuine compliment. We ate a peaceful breakfast together without any of the tension that usually ruined my meals. He did not demand things from me or treat me like a piece of useless furniture. He asked about my comfort and ensured my plate was constantly filled with the best food. After we finished eating, he pushed a small velvet box across the polished table toward me. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up and opened the delicate latch. Inside sat a massive ring bearing the ancient crest of the Northern Duchy. The central stone was a flawless diamond that caught the morning light like trapped fire. "This ring belonged to my mother," Nathaniel explained with an intensely serious expression. "It represents the absolute authority of the northern lands and my immense wealth. By placing this on your finger, I am giving you total control over my entire estate. Every guard, servant, and lord in this territory will obey your commands without question." I stared at the magnificent ring in absolute wonder and sudden panic. "I am just an invisible girl from a minor house," I whispered as fear gripped my chest. "I do not know how to rule a vast kingdom or command respect from powerful people." Nathaniel reached across the table and took my hand firmly in his large grasp. "You are no longer invisible, and you never will be again," he said with fierce conviction. "I chose you because your soul is stronger than any noble lady I have ever met. You endured years of torment and yet you still possess a kind and pure heart." He gently slid the heavy ring onto my finger, and it fit flawlessly. The weight of the metal felt solid and incredibly grounding against my skin. Then his expression shifted into something colder and filled with calculating intent. "There is something else you must know," he continued as his dark eyes narrowed slightly. "In exactly 3 weeks, I am hosting a grand gala right here in this castle. Every single noble family in the kingdom will receive a mandatory invitation. That includes your father, your stepmother, and your sister Beatrice." My heart skipped a dangerous beat at the mention of my abusive family. "Why would you invite them here?" I asked, my voice shaking with lingering anxiety. "I am inviting them so they can witness their greatest mistake," he replied coldly. "They threw you away into the dark corners of their house like a piece of garbage. In 3 weeks, they will be forced to stand in my hall and bow their heads to you. They will watch me place the Duchess crown upon your beautiful head. They will realize that the girl they despised is now the most powerful woman in the land." A cold shiver of intense anticipation ran down my spine at his powerful words. The thought of seeing my stepmother and Beatrice bow to me sent a thrill through my blood. They had spent my entire life trying to crush my spirit and hide my existence. Now, my terrifying duke was giving me the ultimate weapon to destroy their pride. "Do not fear them, my sweet girl," Nathaniel added as he squeezed my fingers gently. "You have the entire strength of the North standing right behind you now. We will show the world exactly who you are, and they will never forget your name." I looked down at the heavy diamond ring shining brightly on my hand. The fear in my chest slowly transformed into a burning desire for ultimate justice. I nodded my head firmly as a confident smile finally touched my lips. "I am ready," I said softly, my voice filled with a newfound and unbreakable strength. "Let them come to our castle, and let them bow." The days leading up to the grand gala blurred into a whirlwind of purposeful activity. I did not spend my time hiding in the lavish chambers like a frightened bird. I took my rightful seat in the grand study alongside my fierce protector. The head steward presented me with endless scrolls detailing the vast estate finances. He expected me to be completely overwhelmed by the complex figures and trade routes. My stepmother had forced me to manage our southern estate's hidden debts for years in the dark. I knew exactly how to spot a false ledger and a greedy merchant. I calmly pointed out a severe discrepancy in the winter grain supply lines. The steward widened his eyes in profound shock and immediate respect. He bowed deeply and promised to rectify the corruption by nightfall. Nathaniel watched me from his dark velvet armchair with a proud and dangerous smirk. He loved seeing his invisible bride transform into a formidable ruler. Word of my sharp mind spread quickly through the sprawling northern fortress. The servants no longer bowed out of mere duty or fear of their terrifying master. They began to bow out of genuine reverence for their new capable mistress. The grand library became my secondary sanctuary within the ancient stone walls. I studied the ancient laws and customs of the harsh northern territories. I learned the names of every minor lord and military commander under our powerful banner. When the local barons arrived to pay their mandatory seasonal respects, I did not hide away. I sat proudly upon the raised dais right beside my fearsome husband. The hardened warriors initially looked at me with deep skepticism and quiet doubt. They expected a fragile southern flower who would wilt instantly in their freezing winds. I surprised them by speaking their rough local dialect with flawless precision. My former tutors had ignored me completely, so I had learned languages by eavesdropping on visiting ambassadors. I commanded their deep respect by showing a clear understanding of their border disputes. By the end of the long reception, the fiercest generals were bowing willingly to me. They slammed their heavy fists against their armored chests in a salute of pure loyalty. They declared loudly that the North had finally gained a mother worthy of its wild spirit. Nathaniel simply smiled and poured me a heavy goblet of rich spiced wine. His unwavering support was the sturdy foundation upon which I built my new empire. One evening, the captain of the Royal Guard requested an urgent private audience. He strode into the drawing room holding a thick wax-sealed parchment. The seal bore the unmistakable crest of my treacherous southern family. My stomach tightened briefly at the sudden sight of that familiar red wax. The captain handed the letter directly to Nathaniel with a low and crisp bow. Nathaniel broke the seal and scanned the elegant handwriting quickly. A dark and dangerous shadow immediately crossed his handsome aristocratic features. His jaw clenched so tightly I truly thought his teeth might shatter under the pressure. He did not destroy the offensive letter but handed it gently across the table to me. "Read what your blood sister has sent to my private gates," he commanded softly. I unfolded the thick parchment with surprisingly steady and calm fingers. The letter was addressed directly to the terrifying Lord of the North. Beatrice had poured her signature cloying perfume over the delicate paper to mask her desperation. She wrote with a sickening tone of false sympathy and arrogant confidence. She apologized profusely for the burden of my presence in his magnificent castle. She boldly assumed I was already locked away in some dark and forgotten dungeon. Then she offered a truly repulsive and entirely predictable proposition. She promised to wear her absolute finest gown to the upcoming royal gala. She suggested that once he was thoroughly bored with his little charity case, she would be waiting. She practically begged him to take her as his true and rightful duchess. A cold and terrifying calm washed over my entire body as I read her pathetic words. The old Audrey would have wept endlessly at such a cruel and heartless betrayal. The new Audrey merely folded the parchment with a steady and precise hand. "She truly believes I am nothing but a temporary amusement," I said quietly into the silent room. "She thinks my eternal suffering is simply an inevitable fact of nature." Nathaniel leaned forward and placed his large warm hands firmly over mine. "Give the word, and I will have her dragged here in heavy iron chains tonight," he offered fiercely. "I will let you personally watch her burn the very dress she plans to wear to our hall." I looked into his dark eyes and saw the genuine promise of violent retribution. I slowly shook my head and offered him a chilling and perfectly calm smile. "That would be far too quick and merciful for my dear sister," I replied smoothly. "Let her believe her foolish fantasy for a little while longer. Let her spend her vast fortune on the most elaborate gown in the entire kingdom. Let her walk blindly into our grand hall expecting to claim a vacant throne. The higher she climbs in her delusions, the harder she will fall upon our marble floor." Nathaniel's eyes darkened with a potent mixture of intense desire and pure admiration. He lifted my hand and pressed a burning kiss against my delicate knuckles. "You are far more dangerous than I ever imagined, my brilliant queen," he whispered against my skin. "We will let the pathetic traitors march blindly into their own complete ruin." The very next morning, I doubled my efforts to prepare the grand ballroom. I ordered the finest musicians from across the realm to practice a booming imperial march. I wanted the music to sound like an approaching and completely unstoppable storm. I requested a cape of pure white fox fur to symbolize my adoption of the winterlands. I commanded the tailors to sew silver threads into my bodice to resemble shattering ice. When Beatrice finally looked upon me, I wanted her to feel a physical chill deep in her bones. The memory of her cruel laughter no longer haunted my midnight dreams. It only served as the burning fuel that kept my internal fire raging fiercely. The courtyard filled endlessly with heavy wagons delivering exotic fruits and rare vintage wines. We were preparing a royal feast that would easily overshadow the banquets in the capital. Every extravagant detail was a calculated move to establish our overwhelming dominance. My father always measured a person's worth strictly by their displayed material wealth. I fully intended to blind his greedy eyes with the immense prosperity of my new permanent home. The preparations were finally and flawlessly complete. The trap was meticulously set with golden bait and diamond-sharp teeth. I stood before the roaring fire in my private chambers and watched the bright flames dance. The timid and broken shadow of my painful past was finally consumed by the burning heat. I was ready to face the cruel monsters who had created my childhood nightmares. I was ready to show them that the invisible girl had evolved into an undeniable force of nature. The harsh winter wind howled against the ancient stone walls of the fortress. The grand courtyard was illuminated by hundreds of blazing iron torches. A long line of ornate carriages slowly rolled through the massive iron gates. The southern nobility had traveled far to answer the terrifying lord's summons. My father's carriage was the most ostentatious and heavily gilded of them all. He stepped out onto the frozen cobblestones with wide and intensely greedy eyes. He immediately began calculating the sheer material value of the towering fortress. My stepmother followed closely behind him with a deeply calculated and wicked smirk. She was already imagining the vast northern wealth flowing directly into her own pockets. Beatrice emerged last from the dark velvet interior of the luxurious carriage. She wore a gown so heavy with imported jewels that she could barely walk straight. The bright crimson fabric dragged loudly across the pristine stone floor. She tilted her chin upward with a sickening display of completely unearned arrogance. She truly believed she was walking into her own royal coronation tonight. The massive oak doors of the grand ballroom swung open to receive the nervous guests. A collective gasp echoed loudly through the crowd of arriving southern lords. The sheer scale of the northern hall was completely beyond their wildest comprehension. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant light over polished black marble. The towering walls were lined with fierce northern warriors in full ceremonial armor. The air smelled richly of roasted meats and extremely expensive imported spices. My father eagerly pushed his way to the front of the gathered noble crowd. He desperately wanted to be noticed by the powerful barons of the northern realm. Beatrice immediately began parading herself among the whispering southern noblewomen. She laughed loudly to ensure everyone looked in her specific direction. A curious lady from a neighboring estate leaned in to whisper a delicate question. She asked about the tragic fate of the quiet sister who was taken away. Beatrice let out a sharp and incredibly cruel bark of mocking laughter. "That pathetic creature is completely gone," my sister declared proudly to the audience. "The Duke merely took her as a temporary and entirely fleeting amusement. She is probably scrubbing the cold dungeon floors as we speak. A man of his extreme power requires a true and refined lady to stand by his side." She smoothed her jewel-encrusted skirt with a sickeningly triumphant smile. The other southern ladies murmured in completely blind and foolish agreement. They all assumed the terrifying warlord had already discarded his invisible toy. They eagerly anticipated seeing Beatrice claim the highly coveted vacant seat of power. Suddenly a booming ceremonial horn echoed through the vast and arched chamber. The cheerful orchestra music ceased entirely in a single tense heartbeat. The heavy chatter of the noble crowd died into an absolute and terrifying silence. The massive crowd parted like a flowing river to clear a wide central path. Duke Nathaniel strode into the grand hall with pure predatory grace. He wore a sharply tailored coat of midnight black velvet and silver embroidery. His dark eyes swept over the massive crowd with chilling and absolute authority. He looked exactly like a dark god descending upon a room of fragile mortals. Beatrice instantly stepped forward to place herself directly in his line of sight. She lowered her eyelashes and offered him a deeply practiced and alluring curtsy. She waited eagerly for him to offer his arm and lead her to the front. Nathaniel did not even break his confident and terrifying stride. He walked straight past her as if she were a completely invisible ghost. The harsh gust of wind from his passing cape made her stumble slightly in her heavy dress. A ripple of muffled shock spread quickly through the watching southern nobles. Beatrice flushed a deep and ugly shade of furious crimson. She quickly recovered and assumed he was simply following strict formal protocol. She firmly believed he would call her up to the front very soon. Nathaniel ascended the raised stone dais at the end of the grand hall. He turned slowly to face the vast sea of nervous and expectant faces. 2 magnificent carved thrones sat upon the raised marble platform. One was quickly occupied by the terrifying lord of the Northern Territories. The other throne remained completely and mysteriously empty. The vacant seat was draped in the most exquisite white fox fur imaginable. Beatrice stared at that empty throne with raw and unmasked hunger in her eyes. My father nervously adjusted his stiff collar while sweating under the heavy chandeliers. He was desperately waiting for his favorite daughter's grand elevation to power. Nathaniel raised a single-gloved hand to command absolute silence from the room. Even the crackling fires in the massive stone hearths seemed to quiet down. "Welcome to my ancient home," his deep voice resonated fiercely through the hall. "You were all summoned here tonight for a very specific and vital purpose. The northern lands have operated without a guiding mother for far too long. Tonight, I present the singular woman who completely holds my absolute loyalty. She is the sole commander of my vast armies and the only keeper of my heart." A sudden murmur of intense excitement rippled through the gathered crowd. Beatrice took a deep and highly confident breath into her tight corset. She actually took a half step forward toward the royal dais. She was completely ready to hear her own name echo through the massive room. Nathaniel's dark eyes locked directly onto my father's sweating and greedy face. A slow and incredibly dangerous smile touched the corners of the Duke's lips. "I command every soul in this room to bow to the undisputed Duchess of the North." He turned his fierce gaze toward the grand sweeping staircase at the edge of the room. The royal trumpets raised their golden horns toward the towering ceiling. A blinding spotlight of magical luminescence illuminated the top of the marble stairs. The heavy velvet curtains were slowly drawn back by the royal guards. The entire kingdom held its collective breath in overwhelming anticipation. The guards standing at the base of the stairs drew their gleaming steel swords. They crossed the sharp blades in a traditional salute of absolute honor. The orchestra shifted from a tense hum to a glorious and triumphant roar. The cruel and perfect trap was finally springing entirely shut. I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtains and onto the platform. The blinding white light washed over my entire body like a glorious shield. I held my head high, my posture perfectly straight and completely unyielding. The white fox fur cape rested elegantly across my bare shoulders. Silver threads stitched into my bodice gleamed like sharp shards of winter ice. I took my very first step down the grand marble staircase. The sound of my silver heel clicking against the stone echoed like a thunderclap. A suffocating wave of complete and utter silence washed over the massive ballroom. Every single eye in the vast room tracked my slow and deliberate descent. I kept my gaze fixed entirely forward, refusing to look down at my feet. I was no longer the frightened girl who hid from her own shadow. I was a woman walking gracefully toward her rightful and permanent throne. The southern nobles leaned forward, squinting blindly into the brilliant light. They were desperate to catch a glimpse of the legendary northern mistress. Whispers broke out like a sudden rustle of dry leaves in a winter forest. They commented on the immense grace of my movements and my striking presence. They wondered aloud what royal kingdom had produced such a regal woman. I reached the middle landing of the grand and sweeping staircase. The bright spotlight shifted slightly, revealing my face completely to the crowd. I paused for a brief second and looked directly down at my biological family. Beatrice was staring up at me with her mouth slightly open in foolish anticipation. Then, her arrogant smile froze completely upon her painted face. Her eyes widened to the size of large saucers as she recognized my features. The color drained from her cheeks until she looked like a walking corpse. "No," she whispered loudly, her shrill voice carrying across the silent floor. "No, that is completely impossible. It cannot be her." My stepmother clutched her throat as if the air had suddenly turned to poison. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the heavy train of her crimson dress. My father stood completely paralyzed, his greedy eyes blinking in absolute horror. The invisible girl they had starved and beaten was standing far above them. They were looking at the very treasure they had blindly thrown into the dirt. I offered them a cold, imperious smile that made them tremble where they stood. I continued my slow and steady march down the remaining marble steps. The northern lords watched my family's bizarre reaction with deep amusement. They realized the trap had officially sprung upon the arrogant southern guests. I finally reached the smooth black marble floor of the grand ballroom. Duke Nathaniel stepped down from his royal dais to meet me halfway. His dark eyes were burning with a potent mixture of pride and intense adoration. He knelt smoothly on a single knee right before the entire gathered nobility. He took my hand and pressed a lingering, reverent kiss upon my diamond ring. The collective gasp from the southern guests was absolutely deafening. The terrifying Lord of the North was willingly bowing to a girl from a minor house. He stood up and offered me his strong, solid arm with a proud smile. "You are magnificent, my beautiful Duchess," he murmured for my ears alone. He guided me effortlessly up the stone steps of the raised royal platform. He led me directly to the magnificent throne draped in pristine white fur. I sat down slowly, smoothing the glittering fabric of my emerald silk gown. The heavy ring on my finger caught the light, flashing with absolute authority. Nathaniel took his rightful seat on the twin throne right beside me. He looked down at the crowd, his expression instantly turning into frozen steel. The warm and adoring husband vanished, replaced by the ruthless northern warlord. "Bring the southern lords forward," his deep voice boomed through the rafters. The royal guards immediately marched toward my trembling family. Their heavy iron boots clicked loudly against the polished black marble floor. They surrounded my father, my stepmother, and a hysterical Beatrice. With sharp nudges of their spears, they forced them to the front of the dais. My family looked up at my throne with faces filled with pure, unadulterated terror. Beatrice was shaking so violently the jewels on her red dress rattled loudly. "You wrote me a very interesting letter, Lady Beatrice," Nathaniel said coldly. His voice was smooth, but it carried the distinct promise of absolute ruin. "You offered to replace the fragile charity case currently residing in my home. You suggested that a true lady should occupy the throne of the North." A ripple of mocking laughter erupted among the watching northern barons. Beatrice looked as though she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her soul. "Look upon your new Duchess," Nathaniel commanded with a sudden, roaring volume. "Look upon the woman you despised, abused, and treated like worthless garbage. You will bow to her tonight, or you will lose your heads before the sun rises." My father did not hesitate for a single second to save his own miserable skin. He threw himself violently onto his hands and knees upon the hard stone floor. My stepmother collapsed right beside him, her face pressed against my shadow. Only Beatrice remained standing, her pride refusing to let her body submit. "I will not bow to her," she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw jealousy. "She is nothing. She is an invisible stain on my family's pristine name." The captain of the guard did not wait for an official order from the throne. He stepped forward and struck the back of her knees with his heavy iron scabbard. Beatrice let out a sharp cry as her knees slammed painfully into the marble. She was forced onto her face, completely broken and utterly humiliated. I leaned forward slightly on my fur-lined throne and looked down at them. The heavy weight of my painful childhood officially lifted from my chest forever. They were finally exactly where they belonged, groveling in the dirt at my feet. The grand ballroom was perfectly silent except for the pathetic sobbing of my stepmother. My father remained pressed flat against the cold marble floor. He slowly lifted his head to look at me with desperate and pleading eyes. "Audrey, my sweet and beloved daughter," he rasped with a sickeningly fake sweetness. The sound of my name in his mouth made my stomach churn with absolute disgust. "We only wanted the absolute best for your future," he lied through his trembling teeth. "We kept you hidden to protect your delicate nature from the harsh world." A harsh bark of genuine laughter escaped my lips before I could stop it. The sound of my laughter echoed loudly through the vaulted ceiling. Duke Nathaniel watched me with a proud and completely supportive expression. He remained silent to allow me full control over my own vengeance. "You kept me hidden because you were deeply ashamed of my existence," I stated coldly. "You treated me worse than the stray dogs roaming your southern estate. You starved me while you draped Beatrice in heavy imported jewels." My father swallowed hard and frantically changed his pathetic strategy. "We made a terrible mistake, but we are still your own flesh and blood," he begged. "We can be highly useful to your new reign here in the vast north. Beatrice can serve as your personal maid, washing your fine dresses." Beatrice let out a sharp gasp of pure outrage from her position on the floor. "I will never serve her," she shrieked wildly, her face stained with ruined makeup. A northern guard immediately tapped the back of her head with his iron gauntlet. She collapsed back onto the stone floor with a muffled whimper of pain. I leaned forward on my fur-lined throne to deliver my final judgment. "You are absolutely correct about one thing, Father," I said with a voice of pure ice. "You did make a terrible and completely irreversible mistake. You threw away a priceless diamond to worship a completely worthless stone. I am the sole mistress of the Northern Territories now. I control the vast trade routes, the deep mines, and the massive armies. You came here expecting to fill your greedy pockets with my husband's wealth. Instead, you will leave this fortress with absolutely nothing. I formally strip you of any trading privileges within our borders. No northern merchant will ever buy your goods or sell you grain. Your failing estate will wither and collapse into absolute ruin." My stepmother wailed loudly, finally realizing the true extent of their doom. She reached out a trembling hand toward the bottom step of my royal dais. "Please show us mercy," she sobbed, abandoning all her previous pride. "Mercy is a gift reserved for those who possess a human soul," I replied smoothly. "You showed me absolutely no mercy when I cried in the dark." I stood up slowly from my throne to deliver my final command. The white fox fur cape draped elegantly around my confident shoulders. "Guards, strip them of their expensive southern cloaks and heavy jewels," I ordered firmly. "Confiscate their gilded carriage and release their horses into our stables. Throw them out the main gates and into the freezing winter winds. Let them walk back to their decaying southern manor on their own feet. If they ever set foot in my territory again, hang them from the highest wall." The royal guards moved forward with swift and terrifying precision. They easily ripped the heavy ruby necklace from Beatrice's pale throat. They stripped my father of his fine velvet coat, leaving him shivering in a thin shirt. Beatrice screamed like a feral animal as a guard confiscated her diamond earrings. They dragged my completely broken family backward across the polished ballroom floor. The massive oak doors of the grand hall were pulled open to the bitter night. My family was violently thrown out into the dark and freezing courtyard. The heavy doors slammed shut with a final and deafening thud. The suffocating shadows of my past were officially locked outside forever. I turned to look at the vast crowd of silent northern and southern nobles. The southern guests were pale and trembling with newfound respect. They understood exactly what happened to those who crossed the northern Duchess. Duke Nathaniel stepped forward and wrapped a warm arm around my waist. He raised his heavy golden goblet high into the bright air. To the brilliant and completely ruthless Duchess of the North, he roared. The northern warlords drew their swords and slammed them against their shields. A deafening cheer of absolute loyalty shook the very foundations of the castle. I looked down at the heavy diamond ring shining fiercely on my finger. I smiled up at my fierce protector, my heart soaring with genuine joy. The invisible girl was dead, and a legendary queen had truly awakened. The harsh and bitter winter eventually surrendered to a bright and vibrant spring. The heavy snow melting from the mountain peaks fed the rushing rivers of our vast domain. My new life as the Duchess of the North blossomed alongside the delicate highland wildflowers. I did not simply wear the heavy diamond ring as a hollow symbol of borrowed power. I completely immersed myself in the daily governance of the sprawling and wealthy territory. The northern people quickly learned that their new mistress was both fair and utterly unyielding. I walked through the bustling courtyards without a single trace of my former hesitation. The servants no longer bowed out of a strict obligation to my terrifying husband. They smiled warmly and offered their genuine respect to the woman who remembered all their names. My traumatic past in the southern manor felt like a faded nightmare from a previous lifetime. Occasional whispers from traveling merchants carried news of the outside world to our high fortress. They spoke of a once proud southern family that had completely collapsed into absolute destitution. My father's grand estate had been seized by ruthless creditors to pay his massive debts. My stepmother was reportedly seen begging for leftover scraps near the dirty city docks. Beatrice had lost her beauty to the harsh elements and her mind to her own bitter jealousy. They had become the invisible ghosts of the kingdom, entirely forgotten and despised by all. I listened to these distant rumors without a single drop of pity or lingering anger. Their ultimate ruin was the natural consequence of their own profound and blinding cruelty. I simply nodded at the merchants and redirected the conversation back to profitable grain shipments. The sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the ancient stone walls of the castle. I stepped out onto the grand highest balcony overlooking the sprawling valley below. The air smelled of fresh pine needles and the sweet promise of upcoming summer harvests. Strong arms wrapped gently around my waist from behind, pulling me against a solid chest. Nathaniel pressed a soft, lingering kiss against the sensitive skin of my bare shoulder. "You are working far too late again, my beautiful and brilliant queen," he murmured softly. I leaned back against his warm embrace with a deep and contented sigh. "A true ruler must ensure her people are prepared for the coming seasons," I teased gently. He chuckled, the deep vibration resonating pleasantly against my spine. He turned me around smoothly so I could look directly into his striking dark eyes. The fierce and terrifying warlord vanished completely whenever he looked at my face. He only showed me the tender and deeply devoted man who had saved my shattered soul. "You have transformed this frozen fortress into a true and glowing home," he said with absolute reverence. He reached up to gently tuck a loose curl behind my ear, his touch incredibly light. "I only brought warmth to a place that was already filled with genuine strength," I replied honestly. I raised my hand and placed it flat against his steadily beating heart. "You saw the true value in a broken girl when the entire world chose to look away." Nathaniel shook his head slowly, his expression turning incredibly serious and intense. "You were never broken, my sweet Audrey," he corrected me with a fierce conviction. "You were a rare diamond buried under thick layers of worthless dirt. I merely brushed the dirt away so the entire realm could finally see you shine." He leaned down and captured my lips in a slow, deep, and breathtaking kiss. The kiss held the heavy weight of his eternal promise and his unbreakable protection. I closed my eyes and surrendered completely to the overwhelming feeling of absolute safety. I remembered the cold, drafty corner of the southern ballroom where this journey began. I remembered wishing the marble floor would simply swallow me and end my miserable existence. Now, I stood upon the highest peak of the Northern Kingdom as its undisputed and beloved ruler. I possessed a wealth that could buy empires and an army that could conquer nations. But my greatest treasure was the unwavering love of the terrifying man holding me close. We finally pulled apart, breathing the crisp evening air together in perfect harmony. I turned back to look out over the vast and prosperous lands stretching toward the horizon. The towering pine forests and the winding rivers all belonged to us. I was no longer a shadow clinging desperately to the edge of someone else's bright light. I was the radiant sun that brought life and immense power to the entire northern realm. The invisible girl had faded away into the forgotten pages of distant history. The Duchess of the North would be remembered and revered until the end of time.